I want to give my views on the theme of today's seminar, why the theme is what it is today, and my view has developed over my formation years growing up in India. And I know some people don't want to hear about India, and of course there are some other people who want to hear about India, but I'm going to talk about India anyway. I see the government as nothing but a froth which floats on top of a fluid. And the more dirty the liquid becomes, the more dirty the froth is. As a kid growing up in India, I always found that goons, tyrants, freeloaders almost spontaneously emerged depending on the kind of section of society that they emerged from. Over the last 8 or 9 years that I have been living in North America, or I lived in North America, I left it a year back. I have seen that the more American society culturally degenerates, I'm using America synonymously with Canada here, its politics is degenerating in direct proportion. To improve the quality of our politics, improvement in culture should proceed. That's what I think. Now, I don't have any prescription on how to improve the culture, but I have an analysis on how the culture degenerates. Now, I have been to 60 countries and I have lived in 4. Other people travel the world to see the world. I travel the world to use it as a mirror to understand myself. Now, 23 years back when I left India, I stopped eating Indian food. I loved Indian food, but I stopped eating it. I stopped having Indian friends. I did not want to have anything to do with India. I hated it. Alas, as you can see, I have left India, but India hasn't left me. I'm still recovering from 23 years later. I'm still recovering from the indoctrination, conditioning, and irrationality of the culture I grew up in. This has been the case despite the fact that right from my earlier years, I revolted against authority and I revolted against irrationality. So that is the grasp of indoctrination on your psyche. Now before, I know some of you haven't been to India, those who have been probably lose touch with the emotions that you feel when you are in India, particularly when you're sitting in such a calm place. So I want to tell you 2 stories about India, 2 very recent stories about India to put you emotionally in the scene of India. So my first story, I was, just a few months back, I was driving around the main square of one of the biggest cities in India. In this square, a bunch of policemen had surrounded a kid and they were slapping him so viciously that he was virtually flying around from one policeman to another. In the meantime, the policemen had made a bunch of kids stand and watch what they were doing. The irony is that these kids, instead of being afraid, were actually giggling and making fun of the whole thing. Now, there were scores of other people walking around that square, families with kids, couples, they were eating their ice cream. I saw no strain on anyone's face. They were just happily walking around their own way. They were completely unconcerned about what was happening to this kid. I can respond to you later why I did nothing about that situation. But anyway, that was my first story. The second story was recently a top federal cabinet minister of India was caught taking a bribe. So he was the top layer of ministers in the federal government of India. His name is Pawan Kumar. Now, what any rational crook would have done in his case is that a rational crook would have called up his friends in the media or friends in the intelligence bureau to ensure that the story did not go out in the public much. Now, this is what this guy actually did. He had a goat bought and brought to his place. He fed grass to that goat, slaughtered it as a sacrifice to the goddess. This guy does not come from one of the backward parts of India. He comes from a constituency which is very likely the richest and most educated part of India. Now, people often think that problem of India is problem of its government. World Bank, IMF, American government, other Western government keep sending their teams to India to understand what's happening there, to prescribe a solution to India's problems. And these teams come back with virtually the same solution every time. They suggest improving the infrastructure, providing better healthcare, better primary education. They want to improve law and order, reduce corruption. Now these look very simple prescriptions. They never ever stick. So the reality is that even after 70 years or so of so-called independence that India got from the English Empire, more than 50%, and I think the real number is about 65%, more than 50% of people do not have access to toilets. They go out in the open to defecate. Now, I know there are some investors here. Any rational investor can do a very quick calculation and say that any investment in some very basic communal sanitation facility would have a payback of months, if not weeks. People would save a lot of time going to the forest. Women would save a lot of time having to, if they could avoid taking someone with them all the time. The health of people would improve, but that never happens. And the question is, why? And a lot of people over the last 3 years and 30 decades or so, that people started thinking about developing countries. People have asked this question, have very confidently said that India would eventually overtake China. They said that India is a democracy and that India has a large part of population which speaks English. So their belief was that India would overtake China. 3 decades earlier, Chinese GDP per capita was comparable with that of India. Today, Chinese GDP per capita is 4 times GDP per capita of India. And on top of that, China is growing at a much faster rate than India is. So, this rational person that I was talking about, who said, and all these teams from World Bank and IMF, when they go to India, they only look at India in a very, very superficial way. He fails to understand the philosophical underpinnings of the country. My view is that the problem of India is not its government. I think the government is only a symptom of the problem, the froth that floats on the top of a dirty fluid. The real problem is within the society, which is extremely superstitious and irrational. Now, what a lot of what you and I perceive as corruption is not how the average Indian perceives corruption as. So there are common expressions in India like you can only scoop butter with a crooked finger, which basically is a rationalization for crookedness. There's another expression which says dharma. Dharma is religion. It's not really synonymous with religion, but dharma, the expression is dharma is only for temple, which basically connotes that you don't have to worry about morality and right conduct once you are outside the temple. So India has never really been through an age of reason or age of enlightenment, in my point of view. A lot of historians would disagree with me. The mindset is still very medieval. It is grossly lacking in any rational philosophical anchors. On top of it all, they have done a very good job of discouraging people to think critically, which ensures that dogma and superstitions and irrationality stay in place. Now, what happens in a society like this in America is that rational people can mostly see the effect that the causes that lead to certain effects. Now, the more socialist a country becomes, the more connection between causes and effects become convoluted and difficult to understand. The minds of those who grow up in such culture, and I'm talking about myself here, becomes entangled, complex mess with corrupted instincts. And when you personally become aware of these issues, and I guess I have been aware of these for all the time that I have, for as long as I can remember, once you have become aware of this thing, when you try to undo the damage, when you try to address one thinking, undo one wrong thinking pattern, it leads to many other thinking patterns which become destabilized. And you must suffer in your mind for decades before you can have any hope for recovery. Now, one of my earliest memories as a kid was of being beaten by my teachers for asking questions. Now, during the winter season, my school, instead of starting later in the morning, would start even earlier in the morning. As a kid of 4 or 5 years, I had to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I still hate waking up in the morning. If you enjoyed a specific subject, so if I liked physics or chemistry and if I wanted to do more in that, my teachers absolutely ensured that I disliked it before I studied it. This is the convoluted brain working. Our teachers would beat up for exactly the same reason that they would praise us some other day. If a kid in the class did something wrong, teacher would beat up everyone. Now, if you went to the teacher and told her who was the wrongdoer, she would beat you for snitching. And then, if something went wrong on another day, and you did not tell her who the wrongdoer was, she would beat you up for not telling her what went wrong. You just grow up utterly confused and cloudy in your thinking, with an uncertain sense of causality. Your mind then becomes capable of absorbing all sorts of garbage, irrational and contradictory beliefs and superstitions. Your eyes and senses no longer experience the truth as they are designed to see. In that society, you're forced to respect authority, not virtues. And I gave you the expression, acceptable expression earlier anyway. The result is that you actually, and I'm not talking figuratively here, you actually become incapable of differentiating between what is right and what is wrong. You become extremely gullible. You speak what sounds good, not what is true. Indeed, speaking the truth for the sake of speaking the truth was a concept which was a revelation to me when I first went to the West. Critical thinking is washed away in dogma and authority. What you end up with is the fact that the system systematically cripples you mentally. Now, when you grow up, you face the same system. A collectivist system detaches people from the consequences of their action. In his interactions with the society, the feedback he gets is in contradiction with how the world works. For the costs get socialized, whereas the gains don't. Trickery and heavy-handedness actually seem to work in that society. And the people who are at the receiving end have no source of retribution. Bad behavior, what you and I might see as bad behavior, goes unchallenged. So the people who do the bad behavior, in their case, in their heart, it never registers that what they're doing is something bad. And truly, real wealth creation in a society like that is an unnecessary hassle with very little economic advantage. From an individual's point of view, time and capital is spent elsewhere. Political connections and bribes look so much better ways to make money. What happens to you? You become dull, apathetic, and mostly non-thinking. And if you can imagine the scenes I told you about two stories, you might understand what I was trying to refer to there. 1 trillion fights keep happening in your brain with no rational recourse to resolve them. You are left with no confidence. For everything you see or believe is a floating abstraction, often in conflict with what you actually see. Now, in my view, it's very important to distinguish between collectivism of Mao's China and collectivism of India. In China, the individual and his survival was in conflict with the state. In contrast, in India, collectivism has been made a part of the DNA of the individual in the society. In such a society, they do exactly more of what created the original problem. Indians are very impervious to rational suggestions, and one must expect to face massive verbal attacks if you try to extricate them from their mental slavery. In my view, the way societies have worked historically, at one point of time, India must crush under its own weight and fall into smaller pieces before you can expect a rational society to re-emerge. Now, some of you might be thinking, why am I ranting about India? Some might think that what I'm saying can never happen in America. To respond to that, I must go back again 23 years back. When I first arrived in the West, the airport was a happy place. The immigration officer addressed me as sir. I looked around to make sure he was talking with me, because how could a bureaucrat not treat me like garbage? Those days, and I can be wrong, I might have been looking at the West with very glamorous, romantic eyes those days, but I think those days, the security at the airport 23 years back was quick and prompt and courteous. What would have been impossible those days happen on a daily basis today. Airport security has no inhibitions about asking people to strip off, including asking old ladies to strip off. The worst irony is that people actually gladly do that. In Canada, when you fly from one airport to another, you actually don't have to take off your shoes. Most people take off their shoes anyway. In the last 23 years, I have seen Americans increasingly groveling in front of ever more mindless bureaucrats. Today, the rational people of the West endlessly worry about segregating their garbage. They worry about all the real and perceived discrimination in the society. They discuss about issues related with sweatshops in countries about which they have absolutely no clue. They want decent decent salaries, proper health care, and minimum wages. And your mouth is sealed through a process called political correctness. It's no longer possible to discuss these things in a rational way anymore. The virus that afflicts Indians now increasingly afflicts those in the West. I think apathy has some rapid roots in this society. Most Americans have no interest in what's happening with Edward Snowden and his condition in Moscow airport. I might be naive, but I guess a few decades back, what Edward Snowden did would have brought the American government down. Not many in North America or in the West care about Bradley Manning or what's happening in Guantanamo Bay. Really, the concept of due process was a Western concept. Not many people understand due process anymore. Try discussing these issues with Americans today, and they start going around in circles, and they start responding irrationally to you, not unlike the way Indians do. Americans are often amused that they hear that so many women in the poor parts of the world do not have a sense of self, they do not have a sense of an independent existence. And that's actually very true. A lot of women don't even understand that they are independent because of the way they are brought up. But then I ask them, what about you? Don't you work half your life paying taxes and following stupid regulations in the West? And they don't get it. We all fail to see our own mental slavery. It's so much easier to see other people's slavery. I think collectivism is increasingly a part of the DNA of people in the West. This individual is likely to keep doing what created the original problem, retrieving his steps back to the medieval period. Would the West become another India? I would not be surprised at all, given what I have seen over the last 23 years. My view is that Obama and Bush are, however criminally minded these guys might be, are only the symptoms of the problem. The problem is the current state of the Western culture and how the individual thinks. I don't worry so much about tens of trillions of dollars of debt. I have been indebted myself, I have been broke many times in life. I think the problem with the West is the cultural degeneration, in which reason and evidence have been replaced by dogma and unverified belief systems topped by lack of critical thinking. Anyway, in conclusion, my view is that lack of liberty is not the result of lack of freedom within our lack of liberty is a result of lack of freedom within our own minds. How we are indoctrinated, made irrational. Bureaucrats and politicians are the scum of the world. They are spineless, repulsive pests. But truly, they are often lazy and stupid. My view is that they will wither away and take to begging on the streets if we as people gave up irrationality and took to critical thinking. Thank you very much. I probably have another five minutes to respond to any questions.
Very good. This was excellent. I wanted to ask, when you look at society today, someone mentioned there are 103 million people in the U.S. on food stamps today. When you look at that bunch, that block, versus the other day I was looking at TV and I saw the NASA personnel, the physicists talking about the orbits of the satellites, the extreme of knowledge and intelligence and capability. These two worlds are so far apart, and so it seems like we're divergent. There is an India inside the U.S. In this block of 100 million that are they, I don't know if they're uneducated, you could comment that it's not one country, but it is stratified. There's some bigger chunks.
Sure, I think some of the lower class poor people can be worse than Indians, I think. Here I see absolutely no reason not to have food through your own efforts. I can today walk to a Chinese store next door and accept a payment of $3 an hour. I can live on $30 a day. I have no problems with that. So I see absolutely no reason why people in this society should be begging or expecting anything from anyone else.
Jayanth, I agree with you with your idea that the state is basically a reflection of the corruption of people. I'm interested, you alluded a little bit to the distinction between the Indian culture, and I think it was Chinese, under a communist state. And what I'm curious about is what sort of, is it some sort of a moral superiority seeing one culture over the other? What would contain, say, the United States versus the West, when you're coming out of India? I mean, what contained, for instance, Doug spoke earlier of the positive news we're getting in Chile. We went from, I don't know, 10 years ago, a communist state to a more free market-leaning environment. We look at the Chileans and say, wow, those are some kind of people, or how does that work? How do you think about that?
Well, I think India is one of the rare societies which has never, and historians can disagree with me on this thing, Indian society has never been through a philosophical shake-up in the society. Indian society hasn't been through a major war like World War or French Revolution like French Revolution. I don't consider India's fight for independence as a proper fight. Nothing has happened in India to shake the conscience of people there for centuries. They wallow in sewage. I'm not saying they don't, but because nothing has shaken their conscience, nothing has created a reason for them to wake up and think about cause and effect. And I think that's what probably I see is what's happening in the West. People no longer have they increasingly lack the courage. And I'm talking more about the masses than some of the good people here, because the good people here are truly the best in the world. But the masses who actually drive the politics of the society, they don't do any rational. There's a huge lack of rational thinking on them, I think.
I'm commenting here. I wonder if you agree with me. Interestingly, you just mentioned the word courage, and to my mind, I kind of dislike the term critical thinking, because to a lot of people, it could mean very different things. What is critical thinking is to criticize somebody's thought. So, to my mind, I prefer to split it up into awareness and courage, because I personally think people will understand the word awareness much easier in terms of you examine everything, not just externally, but internally, which is extremely important. And secondly, courage. It takes courage to bring forth one's ideas and to exercise one's points of view, and that in turn leads to freedom. So,
Well, yeah, thanks for defining the term for me.
It's my second language
Jen, I'm curious about some things that you said about India. In the context of the lack of a set of circumstances which would caused the society to question itself. I suspect that India was regarded as a model, if that's true, but what about partition? What about the fact that Muslim and Hindu cultures that seemingly got along a little bit for 100 years or 200 years, yes, they got practice history, in partition, turned against each other, stole each other's houses, killed each other, raped each other's wives. Wouldn't, and arguably, I'm not saying it did, I'm not even, arguably that happened not because people wanted to spontaneously go at each other, but because people tried to lead prejudiced groups to co-opt them politically. Wouldn't that have caused critical thinking to emerge in places like Gujarat?
Well, Gujarat is certainly, I don't think this whole thing lasted long enough to this was a process of maybe 6 months or a few months. So I don't think enough happened to really put them through a process in which they had time to reflect on what was happening. It might have even worsened the situation by creating more hatred between Muslims and Hindus. Moreover, it is even among, if you went and talked with the very old people in India, in the rural places, they still, sometimes they are known to have asked, why don't those white-looking people come to our villages anymore? And the reason is that it did not really matter to me whether they weren't even, they never got to know that India became independent. So what happened at the border between India and what came to be India and Pakistan, I don't think the message is spread much beyond the people who were directly affected by that.
John, to what do you attribute this change in the West, this lack of courage that they used to have, lack of an ability to look at reality in the face? There are obvious things that people are denying and won't deal with. And just as a secondary thing, what influence do you think education, particularly universities, have had in the West in making people more dependent on the state?
I think democracy is a problem by itself. It basically is something which transfers the concept of collectivism into the DNA of people. And I think the whole concept of democracy makes people think about entitlements and corrupts and sully their mind, I think. I have not been much in the university here, so I wouldn't know about it. But I think that just the general social, the irrationality of the system, which is that you consume drugs, you don't live a healthy life, the government will take care of it, or you have the right to a certain minimum wages. And if you're a single mother, you don't think about what you're doing and end up being a single mother, and it's your right to get money from someone else. I think that's a start of a process of irrationality, and you build up on it. And that's what I think the Western society has been building up on. What might look strange and funny today over a couple of generations would look just normal. So it's now, I think maybe in over the last few decades, being a single mother is an all right thing to be in the Western countries. Anyway, I think I have run out of time. So I'm not sure, but I think there's still some coffee outside. So if you want to have a quick break, the time to be back is on the sheet on your table. Thank you.